2 words, cotton candy, right? I can't be the only one who immediately thought that. The classic blue and pink you find in a cotton candy machine, right? Gotta say, Wuwa's character design is truly a marvel this time around from a visual perspective. I think we can all agree on that. Anyway, second character to come out in version 2.0 is gonna be Roccia. I'm extremely embarrassed to have mispronounced her name despite 2 of my most trusted spreadsheet slaves being Italian. Having just released Carlotta and establishing the type of gameplay specs we'd see from 2.0 DPS units, the next question is how are they going to handle secondary units and supports? That's gonna be Roccia's job. In today's video, we're gonna be discussing the newest Havoc support character, analyzing her abilities, how to play her, how well she performs in the meta, and then the usual stuff like builds, sequences, teams, and so on. I'm just gonna get this out of the way. Roccia's the cutest character since Dungeon, and it's not even close. I mean, look at her. I wouldn't be surprised if people went after her just for her design and playstyle. On this channel though, we talk about practical value, so that's what I'm gonna be looking at today. The Havoc element has been getting special treatment as of late, previously neglected all throughout version 1. Towards the tail end of it, we just got Camellia, one of the best attackers in the game, and then in version 2 we got a new entire Echo set just for them, and now we're getting the Havoc support. Not complaining, mind you, I think it's the coolest element in the game thematically, since of the 6 elements, Havoc's the only one you don't really see in other games. Some might call it Wuwa's rendition of the Dark element, but I don't really see it like that. In any case, Roccia has quite the interesting playstyle, dealing some damage of her own while supporting her team with a range of utility, one such aspect we've never seen before. Contrary to other characters who have one part of their kit being the main focus of their gameplay, Roccia is all over the place. Not in a bad way per se, it's just there's no one part of her moveset that is all the focus. Instead, you can think of Roccia as being split between 2 different parts, utility and personal. We'll start with the personal side first. Like I said, playstyle wise, she's really funny to play, having easily some of the most visually charming attack animations among the cast. Not to mention she fights using a possessed luggage. Notably, her heavy attack has a unique function to it. By holding her left click, she continuously charges up her Forte gauge, and at the end of it, Roccia literally yeets herself forward to attack. Attacking in general builds up her Forte, so in practice you don't have to use her heavy attack at all, but I thought it was key to point out. On that note, let's move on to her Forte. Roccia's circuit is divided into 3 points. When you have at least 1 point of her Forte, you can activate her Forte empowered state by either heavy attacking an enemy or using her skill. Said empowered state consists of her violently bouncing up and down to deal damage around her. The number of times you can bounce correlates to the amount of points you have. If you have 3, you can get all 3 bounces for quite a bit of damage, just over 1000% in total at rank 10. For someone who's supposed to provide a mixture of support and damage, Roccia's personal output isn't that bad, and more importantly, it's integral in building up her concerto, with the 3rd bounce generating a huge amount. The idea is to quickly build up Roccia's Forte to gain your 3 bounces, activate her buffs, and swap out. So her playstyle is not too different from Sanhua. You can get 1 point from ranged skill, 1 point from her resonance skill, and the last point from basic or heavy attacking. Speaking of her skill, there's a good bit of utility here. Roccia creates a moving tornado that can draw enemies into it for a short amount of time, giving her a modicum of grouping, which is always a plus. And, as mentioned, following the animation of her skill, you can then hold the left mouse key to initiate the triple bounce. From this, a typical rotation will go as follows. Intro skill, basic attack off your intro, liberation, resonance skill, mid-air attack 3 times, echo, then swap out, and there you go. Very simple. That comprises the personal side of her kit, now onto the utility side. So alongside some grouping and damage, Roccia's got a surprising amount of support. Let's go through one of her inherent skills. After using her outro, Roccia will override the incoming party member's utility active with their personal skill, utility being your T key, the one where you have the grappling hook, sensor, portable waypoint, etc. Her custom utility active is essentially her skill, a tornado that draws enemies towards it. While it does basically no damage, only a flat 100, this can allow you to group enemies while being on your main attacker. And considering the utility slot isn't really used for combat, it's a free bonus. Roccia's the first character in Wuthering Waves to have a skill like this. Definitely can be useful in the right situation. Second point to mention is her outro skill, which alone will tell you exactly who she wants to pair up with. 20% bonus Havoc damage and 25% bonus basic attack damage. So in concert with other 5-star secondaries, you get 1 part elemental boost and 1 part attack style boost. In Roccia's case, there are 2 DPS characters in the game who make use of both Havoc and basic attack damage. Camellia and Havoc Rover. It's abundantly clear they wanted Roccia to work with them when designing her outro. Lastly, her liberation. I've been holding off on explaining what it does until now due to it being more utility-centric than DPS. After a blast of damage to nearby enemies, Roccia gives her entire party a flat boost to their attack for 30 seconds based on her crit rate, up to a cap of 200. To get the full cap, you need 70% crit rate or more on her. I do want to clarify that it's a flat 200 bonus attack, meaning after calculations and whatnot, you can't increase it to 200 with bonus attack or the like, which might seem underwhelming, but in application, 200 attack is give or take anywhere between a 19 to 22% attack boost. Let's use Camellia as an example. Camellia has a base attack of 450, and when using a signature weapon, she goes up to 1037. 200 attack is roughly around a 19.3% attack boost give or take, so it's not too far off from Sanhua or Denshin's S6. But if you don't have Camellia's signature weapon and are using maybe Somnor Anchor that's 913 attack, 200 attack would be a 21.9% increase give or take. The difference is so marginal that to keep it simple, Roccia's Liberation buff averages out at effectively 20% bonus attack to the entire party, 30-second duration, so practically infinite uptime. It's a good quality of life feature. All in all, Roccia gives Havoc and basic damage, grouping, and bonus attack to the team. Not a bad assortment of utility by any stretch. However, it does bring up a slight issue with her. At the current moment, Roccia is the best companion character for Camellia and Havoc Rover. Here's the problem, it's not by that much. With her kit being split between equal parts personal damage output and party utility, that means her power budget is split down the middle too. As evident by Yinlin and Changli, quick-swap secondaries can be a great addition to your team and make up for their lower support line through higher personal contribution. Roccia certainly fits that criteria, being a middle ground between a quick-swap attacker and a hyper-carry driver, and there's a good incentive to pull for her in the form of her being an excellent booster for two characters. But as I often like to say, in order for a character to be appealing to players, they either have to be the definitive best option for something or the only option for something. While an excellent secondary for Camellia, it's not like she's strapped for secondaries in the first place. She has Dungeon and Sanhua, the former boosting Havoc damage while the latter giving basic attack damage. Strictly speaking, in terms of outro, Roccia does win out over the two 4-stars by giving a higher total, but considering Sanhua and Dungeon both offer a team-wide attack boost of their own, albeit at S6, you're basically comparing outro versus outro. Min-maxing wise, yes, Roccia beats the other two, and if you want to go full sweat, you can definitely pull for her to vertical invest the hell out of Camellia. And on the subject of vertical investment, that would be the biggest thing about the character. Roccia starts higher than the current choices we have for Camellia. If, for example, using arbitrary numbers, Sanhua and Dungeon have a range of 90 to 120% effectiveness from S0 no weapon to S6 best weapon, Roccia starts out at that 120% mark, with the implied potential for upside in that through higher investment you can go to 130, 140, and so on. But I think that's the one part of her that players will be troubled with. Roccia's in a weird position where she's the strongest character in a niche, and that niche is certainly relevant and worth investing in, but her starting point, that being S0R0, is not as high as we expected when considering the relative power scaling of 5 stars in recent versions. Let me show you this. Big shout out to LP, Bedix, and Catalyst once again for living in my basement. Appreciate it. As you can see here, using Roccia with their signature weapon on Midnight Veil as the control group, Sanhua with Emerald of Genesis on Moonlit Clouds results in only a 5% DPS loss on average compared to Roccia. If instead of Verena you play with Shorekeeper, then it goes to about a 7% difference, at which point it might begin to matter, but we're talking about playing a 5-star character and her signature weapon. Assuming you lose 150-50, you need roughly 230 or so pulls to get only 5 to 7% more DPS. That's the issue. If we're being technical about it, Roccia is the best support for Camellia and Rover, but the paywall required to get it is what makes her a hard sell. In fairness, Sanhua is a high demand character too. Having Roccia frees up Sanhua to then be used on one of your other two teams in Tower. But even if you need to use her for another team, there's Dungeon as well. You do suffer a considerably higher DPS cut with Dungeon, but the current priority with the roster and most players is giving each character a suitable teammate. Like I said, Camellia and Havoc Rover don't exactly have issues with secondaries. I think Roccia could have been given a bit more. Either more personal damage, a stronger attack buff cap on her liberation, or something to that effect. I'm aware they're trying not to power creep the game too fast, which is why they're holding Roccia only slightly above the second best option, but you have to acknowledge that if you're designing a niche character like Roccia, you need a strong incentive to pull for them to offset their limited range of usage. Shorekeeper, for example, doesn't have to be lifetime set of Verena as a healing support to be sought after, because you can use her in every single team. She's an all-purpose unit. In other words, you don't have to go super high with her since you can also go super wide. And not to mention, the two have plenty of distinguishable differences in their utility. As a niche unit, Roccia doesn't have the freedom to go super wide. She can only pragmatically support Havoc units, more optimally Havoc basic attackers. So altogether, she's a really good secondary who can support two really good characters. But the current issue is the price tag behind someone who is basically trying to reinvent the wheel. Granted, if they do make more Havoc DPS units in the future, Roccia's equity might go higher. We'll have to see. One area that can also increase the market value is if we enter a more AoE-centric meta where grouping becomes more essential. In the meantime, let's get through the guide part of the video, starting with sequences. Sequence 1 enables Roccia to get a full Forte with just intro and skill while also generating more Concerto energy for a faster swap out. She also gains super armor during her bungee jumping. This allows you to have a quicker rotation, but it's not obligatory to play her optimally. Sequence 2 gets interesting though. Each bounce over Forte grants 10% bonus Havoc damage to the entire team, stacking up to 3 times. At full stacks, you get another 10% for a 40% Havoc damage boost to your whole party. Here is where Roccia has the advantage. Free-to-plays obviously only care about S0, R0, or maybe S1 or R1 at most. Pay-to-win players can push a bit higher, usually S2, R1. At S2, Roccia convincingly outperforms the competition, and then of course more and more sequences makes the gap even wider. The remainder of Roccia's sequences are meant to increase her own personal damage and push her to be closer to a main attacker. If you want to go down that route you may, but if your goal is to just play her for support, a good stopping point would be S2, R1 I'd say. That said, every sequence from S3 onward gives a notable boost to her DPS, especially her S4 and S6. We just went over how despite being a secondary, Roccia plays like a quick swap attacker. If you're a fan of bouncing on people with a living suitcase, by all means. Weapons. Weapons are actually one of the areas where I feel Roccia could have been improved a bit. Tragic Comedy affords a nice crit boost to help you get to that 70% breakpoint, with the weapon passive offering an additional 12% attack and 48% heavy attack boost. A weapon like this appears to be more suitable for a main DPS, doesn't it? But that's technically how you have to build her. She takes up a fair bit of field time for someone who's ultimately meant to set up the main attacker, hence why her weapon's designed the way it is. But I do think it was a missed opportunity for her weapon to not have some way to buff the incoming Resonator upon swapping out. The Gauntlet category has a problem with support options, or lack thereof, which on a side note is also a big reason why Jinshin has a hard time being a support character. There's literally no support option for the weapon category. Now Roccia is a hybrid between an attacker and a support, hence why she's a secondary unit, not a DPS. However, her contribution towards her team is where things get tricky because secondary DPS characters make up a significantly smaller chunk of the party's overall total DPS. So while the only way to improve the performance of Roccia's team through her is to increase their personal DPS, it would be more efficient to work on your actual attacker. And so I feel like a weapon geared more towards support, like a static mist type passive but on a gauntlet, would have been a better direction, but that's just my opinion. It's a good weapon though, and frankly her best option, for the simple reason that we have no other good options. As a reminder, the DPS comparison earlier in the video assumes Roccia has her signature weapon. If you're using anything else, the gap between her and Dungeon and Sanhua diminishes. Although, like I mentioned, if you decide to go higher sequences, then it becomes more enticing due to increasing her personal DPS by a noticeable margin. Echoes. If it wasn't obvious, Midnight Veil. It's a perfect set for Roccia courtesy of the 15% Havoc boost on the incoming Resonator, and she can use the Nightmare and Permanent Terran, which affords her heavy attack and Havoc damage. You can go Moonlit, especially if you have good substats, and play for a more supportive build, but I wouldn't recommend farming Midnight Veil and getting her set up on that. Main stats, crit rate 4 cost. The goal after all is to get her to 70%. Havoc damage on 3 cost and attack on 1 cost. Build her like you would a DPS character essentially. On that note, substats, you want to get her energy to about 120-125 give or take, then focus on crit, then attack and heavy attack percent. Very straightforward, I don't think you'll have any trouble getting her set up. Lastly, teams. I've kind of been saying her teammates throughout the entire video, but for thoroughness, Roccia is a secondary attacker. The two she pairs best with are Camellia first and Havoc Rover second. If you're aiming to deck out either with the highest DPS imaginable, then Roccia with her personal weapon is best in slot. For support, unsurprisingly we have Shorekeeper and Verena. I would actually recommend Shorekeeper more though, mostly because with her, you might be able to forego crit rate main stat and instead go crit damage on Roccia's 4 cost, getting the crit rate through substats or personal weapon and Shorekeeper's buff. That could be a noteworthy increase to her personal DPS, so I'd prioritize Shorekeeper for your team's healing slot. For my final thoughts, Roccia's a perfectly serviceable unit within a niche, and I personally find her adorable and fun to play. The primary reason to pull for her is for Camellia, so if you're a Camellia main, you might want to consider Roccia for posterity. Admittedly though, her cost effectiveness is not on the same level as most of the 5 stars we had in the past. You do have to put more into her, which might make her more tough on budget players. But as long as you manage expectations, you'll be more than satisfied with her. It's also worth accounting for the fact that her crowd control utility is something that cannot be measured in DPS charts, but is a relevant strength in her repertoire, especially in AoE tower floors. Anyways, that wraps up my analysis and guide on Roccia. Let me know your thoughts on her in the comments down below, as well as if you plan to pull for her or not. But for now, if you enjoyed the video, a like and subscribe would be much appreciated. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my first impressions video on Carlotta if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.